The shadows creep all around you.
So a few years back, I had gone out with some friends to the mountains for a camping trip. And by camping, I mean everyone gets drunk or high around a fire in the middle of the woods, and then passes out in their trucks. I was always the youngest of the friend group, and this took place before I found my taste for mind-altering substances. I'm typically something of a skeptic, and if this had happened nowadays, I'd probably blame it on being drunk. But I was stone cold sober the whole time, which is why I feel so sure of what I saw. We're all out at the campsite, maybe 10 to 15 of us. I'm sitting on someone's tailgate smoking a cigarette when my friend, John, comes up to me, clearly intoxicated. John was the one who I came out to the campsite with, and probably my closest friend out of anyone there. He asked me if I wanted to go on an adventure with him in the woods. I figured that, if nothing else, I should probably go with him just to make sure he didn't drunkenly fall over and hurt himself. Not to mention, even though I didn't drink or do any drugs back then, didn't mean I was opposed to fun adventures in the forest. So we walked past the tree line that surrounded the campfire and into the dense trees. And it was a pretty clear night, so although it was dark, it wasn't pitch black. We came to a clearing that seemed to be made up of many flattish boulders and rocks. We were looking up at the night sky and John was drunk talking, and I was listening and nodding along with whatever nonsense he was saying. He sat down on one of the flatter rocks, and eventually just laid down and passed out. I tried to jostle him awake, but he just kept mumbling for me to let him rest a while. Since this is usually how John behaves when he's drinking, I complied and figured I'd head back to the campsite and check on him again in a little bit. I go back, talk to a few people, smoke a few cigarettes, and then decided to go back and check on John. Maybe 10 minutes had passed. I'm walking back to the clearing where I left him, and already from afar, noticed that he wasn't in the spot that I left him. I kept going, figuring that he must have gotten up and wandered off somewhere. As I'm walking, I noticed a shadow in the shape of a human standing behind a shrub of sorts, a few feet to my right. I stopped, figuring it was John messing with me. I said, "Dude, come on, let's head back to camp." And no response. And then the stereotypical, "Please, you're not scaring me." And still nothing. I moved closer to the shadow and noticed that I can't make out any distinguishable features. No shirt logo, no eyes or any face for that matter. Just a vacuum of black that stood in the shape of a human, hanging out with me in the forest. I backed away, putting it all together that it wasn't John, and I ran back to camp. I checked the truck that John and I drove out, and there he was, sleeping on the bench seat. I did a quick head count and everyone that I had recalled being at the camp was still there. The only thing that convinces me that this was paranormal was just the sheer absence of light that this thing took the shape of. Just pure darkness. Whenever I tell this story, John always gets the chills imagining that this thing was probably out there with him when he was passed out by himself. The general conclusion was that John had stumbled back while I had left him, and I just didn't notice that he had returned. Like I said, I'm a skeptic, so I always try to rationalize these things. But this is the one experience that I've had that I just can't believe was simply my eyes playing tricks on me. I've heard of shadow people, but I always thought those were just what people saw during sleep paralysis, not out in the wilderness and fully awake. If anyone could give me an idea of what this could have been, that'd be much appreciated.
So this story happened a few years back, but now that I found this subreddit, and a proper place to post it, I'm going to share it. So let's kick it back to around 6 years ago, and I'm around 11 years old. I sleep with my door closed to my room all the time because I don't like my dog jumping on my bed at midnight, scaring the daylights out of me, no matter how much I love her. But that month, my door would begin rattling as I laid in bed, like something was trying to grab on to the knob or push the door open, but just wasn't strong enough or able to get a good enough grip on it. And it would make my door just kind of rattle back and forth. It would go on for a short bit, but it would eventually subside after a max of about probably 2 minutes of rattling, leaving me sitting there thinking, what the hell? And trying to force myself back to sleep. This was going on for several nights in a row. I bet there were more happenings than I had managed to sleep through, but I always remembered waking up to the noise and just staring at the door as it did its thing. So I eventually get sick of all this nonsense and suspect it is my dog leaning and pressing against my door trying to get in. I decided it was better to know it's her than be in fear wondering and that I was losing sleep. I still get chills just typing this out, and this story is the biggest reason I still sleep with a nightlight and believe in ghosts. So that night, it's pretty standard bedtime procedure. Brush teeth, make bed, crawl in, nighty-night, and I sleep for a few good hours before I suddenly wake up to a voice whispering in the night. Some real cryptic horror movie bullshit. Kind of like the whispering at the end of the Gravity Falls theme song. I just kind of sit there listening to it and start to look around the room and then towards my door. There he is, standing there in the doorway, a shadow. A silhouette of a very tall man standing there in the doorway that was darker than the darkness around him. Very easily to distinguish just standing outside my room. I, having no idea what's going on, just ask, "Dad?" And it stops. Dead fucking silence for a good 3 seconds as me and it are staring each other down. Then it leaves. It slides out of the doorway to the left in a fluidness that isn't natural in any way, shape, or form. And like that, it's gone. It's 3 a.m., dead silent. Just me, my bed, and the night. Still scares the shit out of me till this day. Congrats if you made it this far, and I'm glad I could share.
I think that I should start by stating that I am a witch. I was taught my traditions by my father, godmother, and my auntie, who was not actually a blood relative. All of my life I have had a healthy belief in the paranormal, but have always paired that with a strong sense of skepticism. Something being preternatural is never my go-to explanation. That being said, I have had several encounters with spirits and other paranormal entities throughout my life. Most of them nothing I would call frightening or hostile. About 10 years ago now, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see a massive shadow person standing in the doorway of my bedroom. From the moment I laid eyes on it, I would start to panic. There was just something inside of me that knew it was waiting there until it could get into my room and get to me. I know what you may be thinking, but I was not experiencing sleep paralysis. I was fully able to move and often did to turn on the light and wake up my partner in bed with me, or yell for my roommate if I was sleeping alone. The figure always disappeared when I flicked the light on, and the feeling of dread would slowly fade. That happened once a week for almost 6 months. Eventually it escalated. I would wake up to see the figure in my door, turn on the light and call for someone to come comfort me, and then eventually go back to sleep. I would then later wake up on my kitchen floor ravenous, often eating something from my icebox still cold and with my bare hands. It was at this point I really started to be concerned about what the hell it was that was watching me while I slept. I was used to shadow people popping in to take a look at me. It had been happening my whole life, but something about this was different. The feeling I got from this thing was the closest to inhuman evil I'd ever felt. From there it got worse. I would see it multiple times a week and wake up on my kitchen floor. I even began to see it just out of the corner of my eye when I would go outside to have a cigarette, just lurking. No matter what I did to try and cleanse myself from my apartment, eventually the thing that watched me while I slept would come back. One night I woke up and it was not in my doorway. It was clung to the corner of my ceiling opposite where I slept, still sitting and watching. I immediately tried to wake up my partner, who was sleeping next to me at the time, sobbing and pleading for him to wake up, which he did. He rolled over and looked straight at me. He smiled and wiped away my tears before pulling me into a hug. At first I was comforted and the feeling began to go away. That was until he began to squeeze me tighter and tighter until it began to actually cause me pain. I started to struggle and screamed at him to stop what he was doing. All he said in reply was,
Shh, it's okay. I've got you now. You're mine now.
Finally, I kicked him off me and ran into the living room, turning on all of the lights. Not long after, my partner came out after me, asking me why I had attacked him. After taking some time to calm down, I explained what happened. With a wide-eyed expression of confusion on his face, he said with absolute conviction that he had zero memory of doing any of that. From that moment on, I was cleansing me and everyone and everything in that apartment when I woke up and right before I went to bed. The experiences happened less and less until finally they stopped altogether when we moved out of that apartment. I finally was free from whatever the hell that was, or so I thought. Fast forward a couple of years. I'm living in this amazing house that is perfect for throwing parties. A big backyard with pool and a hot tub. The one side of the house is up against the football field of a school, so no neighbors to annoy with sound. Along that side there is a wooden fence for privacy, with a gate that goes out to a long dirt driveway for extra parking. Like we always did on weekends, we were throwing a huge party. At some point during the night, I had told a friend of mine the story about the thing that watched me while I slept. He was also a witch, and we were sharing our experiences over some cocktails. It was just a little bit before midnight, I think, when I noticed one of my very best friends just standing in the open side gate. He looked like he was in a stupor, hands in his pockets and frowning. I wandered up to him, and being my sassy self, I teased him for being too drunk. Then, out of nowhere, he reaches back and slaps the ever-loving shit out of me. My ears were ringing, I could taste blood in my mouth. It took 2 people to pull me off of him, as I was trying to beat the shit out of him for slapping me. Eventually, everyone calmed down and we put my friend to bed. In that moment, I honestly just attributed his bad behavior to the fact that he really was just too drunk. That was until I was sitting down having a smoke, and I looked over to the open gate and saw him standing there in the light. I reached for my witch friend next to me and pointed, stammering, asking him if he saw it too. My heart sank when all he could do was nod. Maybe it was the fact that my blood was still up from my best friend slapping me, or maybe something in me just came loose, but in that moment I had absolutely had enough. For a little bit of context, I have a fairly destructive energy. I am not the type of witch who creates, but rather I break down. My father always joked that I was entropy incarnate, with how many things, spooky and not, I destroyed as a child. So in that moment, being absolutely done with this invasive black shadow man, I stood up and started screaming at it. As I did so, The entire fence along the side of our yard began to shake violently in massive rolling waves. I envisioned tearing this thing into pieces, and slowly but surely it grew smaller and smaller, until finally there was nothing left of it. In that moment, I felt a weight lift off of my chest, in that way that you did not know it had ever been there in the first place. From that night on, I never saw or felt the thing that watched me while I slept again. It has taken me almost 5 years since that night to feel really comfortable talking about it. For a long time I was afraid that talking about it is how it found me at that house in the first place. I know this is really out there, but I swear to you, this is what I experienced. I hope that if anyone else out there has ever had anything like this happen to them, that they were able to destroy it like I was.
It was a sunny day outside when my dad and his 3 brothers went to visit their grandfather. His house had a small apple orchard in the backyard. You could still see the apple trees to this day. Although the last time and the first time I had seen his grandpa's house, the trees were dead and twisted. My dad and his brothers sat at a small table in the kitchen while their parents spoke with the other adults in the living room. They were clicking away at viewfinders, holding the viewfinder up to the light emitted from the kitchen window. Their grandfather came into the kitchen and asked, "Would you kids like some apples?" My dad enthusiastically said yes, along with his brothers. The apples were always fresh and delicious. Their grandfather opened the basement door, which was located in the kitchen. The door closed behind him, and they could hear his footsteps walking down the stairs. They continued to click away at their viewfinders. Eventually, one of the brothers noticed that it had been a while since their grandfather went down into the basement, around 30 minutes ago. They decided to go down and make sure everything was all right. My dad walked over to the basement door and opened it. He took one step down past the door as his foot hit the first step. He heard a roaring, deep laughter. My dad called out to his grandpa, and he could hear his grandpa's voice say, "Let me go! Let me go!" My dad rushed down the stairs, and on the wall were 2 high-definition shadows cast upon it. My dad's youngest brother followed him down the stairs and stood on them, holding the railing and watching the wall, and the shadows almost as if in shock. My dad yelled, "Grandpa!" My dad, believing it was a prank, he looked around the basement. There was a white sheet which was hanging up down there. He was sure that behind it he would find out what was making the shadows on the wall. He lifted the sheet, but nothing was there. He looked down, and there was a crate of apples lying on the floor. My dad turned around and walked up to the shadows that were cast on the wall. The largest shadow's entire size did not fit the wall. My dad says that the size of the shadow would have it made it at least 2 or 3 stories tall. As he looked closer at the shadow, he could see each long individual strand of stringy hair that hung on its arms. Its body was thin, almost like the body of someone who you would have seen in the pictures of Auschwitz, while also with defined thin muscles in its arms. Its head had huge horns leading backwards, and the head was that of a goat. It held the shadow of his grandfather in his hands, holding him at the waist and shaking him while laughing. His grandfather beat at its arms, screaming to be let go while it shook him like a doll and laughed. My dad's youngest brother yelled, "Let my grandpa go! Let my grandpa go!" The shadow seemed to be completely unaware of them being there. My dad and his brother went back upstairs to get help. His other two brothers, who were too afraid to go downstairs because of the sheer sound of its laughing, they followed them into the living room. This was during the time when kids should be seen but not heard. Everything that they said was ignored as kids trying to get attention or their imagination. They went back into the kitchen and sat silently, not knowing what to do. Thump, thump, thump. They could hear footsteps coming up the stairs from the basement. My dad prepared himself to see the true form of the shadow before them. The door opened and it was their grandfather. He held a crate of apples in his hands. My dad ran up to him and lifted his shirt to check his waist and stomach. He asked him, "Grandpa, are you burned? Are you burned?" His grandpa looked down at him and laughed and said, "Why would I be burned?" My dad looked up at him and said, "Grandpa, you were in hell." Later on, Grandpa shared his experience when he was in the basement. He went downstairs to grab an apple crate. He thought he heard my dad's voice clearly yell, "Grandpa." So he turned around for a moment to see if he was there with him. No one was there. He was a bit spooked, and so he started to walk up the stairs. That's when he heard, "Let my grandpa go." This really spooked him, so he tried to quickly go back upstairs. He believed he was down there for only a couple of minutes. When he met my dad and his brothers upstairs, they had a certain look on their face. My dad ran up to him and lifted his shirt and asked if he was burned. Later on, when he became very ill, he told my dad that he was worried what was going to happen to him when he died. For a while, his life story was kept in the dark from many family members. In fact, his life was so secretive that some family members believed he was part of the mafia in the past. When I found out what he had done at times in his life, I found out why it was kept a secret.
This happened when I was young, and has disturbed me far worse than any other experience. When I was 10, my mum had just given birth to my brother. We lived in a small apartment, so this resulted in us moving to a rental home. The home was simple enough, a small brick house near some farmland in southern USA. It was neat because a Native American historical site was within walking distance. I was excited about the move. The first few weeks in the house were normal enough. My stepdad got a new work schedule, so we had to change sleeping arrangements. Before, we would all just sort of watch TV and pass out whenever. His new schedule was getting to work by 4 a.m, so that meant lights out early. I remember being upset that all the lights had to be out early, and I could not fall asleep at that time. Lying awake in pure darkness, I had a feeling of fear come over me. Next thing I know, I was on the ceiling, looking down at my body. I stayed up there paralyzed for a few minutes. I will never forget it, still to this day, 20 plus years later. This is the only time an out-of-body experience has ever happened to me. Of course, I told my mum I was terrified. She says nightmare, but I was not asleep. I remember being tired at school because I snuck out of bed and turned my closet light on all night until my stepdad woke up. Did not sleep. The next day after school, I fell asleep for a long nap. Pretty much the only time I would get any rest for the next few nights. When the lights out came the next night, I did not sleep. I kept thinking about my ceiling experience. My bedroom was connected to a large open den and hallway where my baby brother's crib was located. This den also had a sliding door to the backyard and pasture. I had my door cracked halfway, And as I turned my attention from the ceiling to the door, that's when it started to happen. What I refer to as the fear started to come over me. A tingly, frightening sensation. That's when I saw it. A solid black, shadowy figure that wasn't exactly man-shaped, but resembled a man is the best way I know to describe it. The shadow stood there, watching me from outside the doorway. All of a sudden, I felt a pressure on my chest and throat area, like this thing was taking my breath and life right out of me. I wanted to scream, but I could not. Eventually, I could breathe, and the entity just disappeared back to the hallway where it came, and I went screaming to my mum again. Of course, another nightmare, she says, as I'm falling asleep on the way to school. I remember getting yelled at by teachers for trying to sleep in class. The next night would be my final encounter with the shadow man, entity, alien, whatever it was. This time I begged my mum to leave my light on. She tells me I can turn it back on when stepdad falls asleep. I'm wide awake, scared to death, and nothing happens for a long time. Then the feeling comes, like clockwork. I'm not sure what time these events occur, but if I had to guess, I'd say around midnight. This time the figure appears to float right up beside my bed and put their hands around my neck. The same feeling as before, but closer. I am terrified but cannot move or breathe, and I'm wide awake, sucking the life out of me. Repeat, no sleep process until early morning or on the way to school. Repeat, mum saying it's a nightmare. Thankfully, stepdad suggests buying me a TV for my room that I kept on at night. I'm not sure if these entities hate the light. Whatever the situation, I never saw the thing again. Doesn't change the fact that I still fear the dark and sleep with a TV on to this very day. Before, I was never afraid. Before, I never cared about the paranormal. Ever since that week, I research and seek out answers. These things are real, and I do not believe scientists have it all figured out by saying sleep paralysis, because I was never asleep. Mankind has experienced shadow people for centuries. The paranormal is something you have to experience before you become a believer. Keep the lights on and stay safe out there.
This is a story from when I was about 6 to 7. One of my oldest neighbors used to babysit some kids my age on the summers. Since they were about my age and the only boys on my street, I would always go over to see them. My neighbor's house is right on the edge of a small forested area, and there are tons of trees and areas to hide in. There was also a small path cutting right through the wooded area, so sometimes people would go through my neighbor's yard to get to it. One time I was playing with my friends in my neighbor's yard. When I looked over at one of the trees, I saw a dark black figure. Not like the race black, but shadow black, standing beside it. The figure was pitch black. No facial features, no clothes, nothing. And he wasn't like see-through like a shadow is. He was pitch black. He ducked behind the tree before I could get a better look. I told my mom about it, but she didn't think much of it since I was so young. A few months later, I was riding my bike past my neighbor's yard. I looked over at the trees, and sure enough, he was there. I stared at him for a moment before looking back in front of me. I hit the curb and scraped up my knee. When I looked back, he was gone again. This is the last story I have about him. About a year after I saw him, me and my sister were in my backyard playing on our playset. All of a sudden, I heard my mom yelling for me to grab my sister and come in. My sister was like 3 or 4 at the time. I grabbed her and ran back in. Just before I got inside, I glanced over at the fence, and there he was, staring at me and my sister. I asked my mom why she called us in, and she told us it was because she saw the man too, and thought he was some creep or something. She described it exactly as I had. I never saw him again. Nowadays, I still don't know if it was some sort of spirit, or just some type of creepy dude that I happened to see multiple times. My sister was too young to really remember him, but me and my mom still talk about it till this day. Edit. Tonight I was talking to my mom about the shadow man, and she told me that one time she was pulling out of our driveway and she saw him in our neighbor's yard. She didn't tell me this originally because she was afraid it would scare me.
A few years ago, I decided to ride my bike out at night time. I wasn't allowed to go out alone, so my grandparents came out to supervise. My mum was very protective and said that when I go riding I need to be fully prepared and to be under full supervision. Riding in the dark was way out of what I was allowed to do, so my grandparents strapped lights and reflective sheets to my bike head and hands. I had pads on my elbows and knees and a huge helmet. All the equipment was practically weighing me down, but nothing was going to stop me from going on that bike ride. I got outside and started doing laps around the neighborhood. At the time, my grandparents lived in an upper-class gated community, though many weird events happened there. I recall one time I had been followed by a young couple in an older car that wouldn't take their eyes off me whenever I noticed them. Anyway, there was this one house that everybody got the chills from. It was like a house out of those fever dreamish horror movies that make you question your sanity. It was a huge white house with vines that grew sporadically on its walls. Nobody was ever home. Through the windows you could see piles upon piles of items all over. The lights were always off and nobody ever entered or exited the house. I turned to look at the house. I wasn't at all close to it. I was more in the middle of the street. I slowed my pace and directed my focus on the upstairs windows. To my surprise, a light was on, and what I saw next scared me shitless. I mean, I dropped my bike and ran screaming all the way back to my grandparents' house. A woman was right in front of the window. She had been watching me. When I tell you she had no color, I mean it. Her whole body was pitch black. Clothes, skin, eyes. It was absolutely terrifying. It was absolutely horrifying. I stared at her for a few seconds. It looked fake. I thought maybe I had been looking at a mannequin. But this creature raised its hand and smacked it across the window, then slowly dragged it down. I fell off my bike and ran. I ran that whole way home, not worrying about everything I had left behind. When I tell you I ran at speeds of which had never been seen on this planet before. I could barely breathe or speak when I got back. My parents went to go get my bike since I was terrified and said the light was off and nobody was there. Hello watchers and listeners. I hope you enjoyed my belated 100 subscriber special episode. If you enjoyed that video, please hit the like button, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. A huge thank you to all the Reddit users who allowed me to use their stories. A link to each story is in the description below. And a big thank you to Marie LivesTheHorror for collaborating with me again. We also did a 100 subscriber special on her channel as well. The link will be in the description when it's available. If you have any stories you would like to share, please send them to my email, which is also in the description below. As always, many thanks to everyone who continues to support me and who helped me reach this milestone 100 subscribers. I really do appreciate it. Stay safe.